Thank you all for being here. And without further ado, cheers to our presenter tonight. This is Dr. Rebecca Wiewel, and she's going to be presenting on pottery and peoples of the past. So thank you for joining us, and have a great evening.
All right, thanks, Molly. I'm glad to be here in the First Peoples Hall. It's kind of an interesting experience to be like the only people in a museum, so that's exciting. I want to share with you, first of all, I don't know where everyone is, but we are in Nebraska at the museum here. And I actually work for the National Park Service at a place called the Midwest Archeological Center, and that's just down the street from the University Museum right here. And we actually work in a number of different parks around the middle of the country. So we work up here in the plains, in the Midwest, and all the way down in Arkansas. And today, that's where I'm going to be talking about is Arkansas. I actually worked in a previous job there and lived there for several years. So while I work for the Midwest Archeological Center, we do make our way kind of outside of the Midwest from time to time. And so we're gonna go to Arkansas now and talk a little bit about my research there. So if we can go to the slideshow. Might take just a minute, so bear with me. But hopefully you should see something that says Cardon Bottoms at the top of your screen. So in the middle of this, there's a little red dot and a yellow block that says Cardon Bottoms. And that is kind of the location that I'll be talking about tonight. That's where a lot of the archaeological research that I'll be discussing was done. But I wanted to give you kind of an overview of where that is. So it's in central Arkansas, about 40 miles or so from Little Rock in the middle of the state, right along the Arkansas River. And the site itself, the pictures that you'll see of the excavation will be pretty flat in kind of this agricultural field. But I wanted to show you some views of Petit Jean State Park that's very close nearby. And for those of you, I know that's not the French pronunciation, but that's how the locals say it. So it's Petit Jean State Park. It's beautiful uplands right there that you can see from the Cardon Bottoms site. There's a lot of rock art on those bluffs as well that probably members of the community I'll be talking about made. So if you can go to the next slide. I wanted to set the stage a little bit here and take you back about 500 years ago before I get into the archaeology and discuss kind of what we know about people who are living in the southeastern United States. So if you were to transport yourself back 500 years, you would see a bunch of different chiefdoms that archaeologists call Mississippian chiefdoms across the southeast. So these are all pretty organized communities, and if you look at the kind of the green triangular shapes on that map, those are all showing basically the capitals of different chiefdoms. So those are mound centers where American Indian groups built these large earthen mounds. And during the time period that we're talking about, those mounds would have mostly been flat-topped platform mounds with buildings on top. And those buildings would have housed the chiefly elite members of those villages, as well as some important ceremonial buildings. So those would have been kind of like the capital areas, and then a series of smaller agricultural villages would have surrounded the capitals. And so this is the map showing you kind of the different territories that you would see. Now the reconstruction that you see there on the right, that's of the Parkin site in northeast Arkansas, and that's right on the Mississippi River. And that's showing you what we think the site looked like based on archaeological excavations. And a couple of features I want to point out, of course, there are mounds there. And then, I can actually show this on the slide, maybe. If you notice, the site is bounded by this wooden stockade. And beyond that, there was actually a ditch with a defensive moat on 3 sides, and then the river on 1 side. So they had these defensive structures kind of put into play in these chiefdoms. And that was because these agricultural villages were always kind of vying for land and resources with one another. So it was kind of a pretty complex political system. So if we can go to the next slide. That chiefdom type society that I just described, where you see a little bit of hierarchy, you see those mound centers and big agricultural villages, that would have been the society that some of the first European explorers in the Southeast would have come across. So in the Southeast in particular, De Soto's entrada is a pretty important and significant event. He first landed in Florida in 1538 and then made his way across the Southeast, stopping at several chiefdom societies. And then in 1541, he crossed that Mississippi River into northeastern Arkansas. So that Parkin site that I showed you on the previous slide, that's actually where that province of Kaskee is in the northeast corner of this slide. So we think that that's the location that De Soto actually visited in 1541. Just to the right of there, Kaskee, sorry, that's okay. He was in Keys as well, but in Arkansas, he was in Kaskee. That's where the Parkin site was. So I wanted to mention, if you look at the route, the big red line that's slashing across Arkansas, that's the way that a De Soto expedition went through Arkansas, we think. And we think that for a couple of reasons. So we have some accounts, some written accounts that have survived of De Soto's trek, and those describe distances and geographical features to an extent. But this reconstruction is actually based off of Charles Hudson's work, and he's a noted historian who actually paid attention to archaeological findings of where these European encounters might have happened. And so that's the route that we thought he took. And he was actually in Arkansas for quite some time. And I wanted to mention a few of the things that kind of happened here. So if you want to, you can go to me, I'll be talking for a minute. Some of the issues that happen with a big, giant expedition making its way across the Southeast. So De Soto came with hundreds of men, and of course he came from Spain, and so didn't bring a lot of supplies with him. So once he entered the Southeast, he actually had to rely a lot on native food stores. And most of the time, those were given at first as kind of a matter of hospitality, but frequently things got a little tense and violent interactions happened, and so a lot of food stores were raided. And those food stores are things that those chiefdom societies depended on. Those were their kind of like emergency worst case scenario. If there's a bad crop, if we have a war and we need those supplies, we use those. Well, now you've got this big group, this army of hundreds of people who have used all of those. The other thing that De Soto is doing is enslaving a bunch of American Indians, a bunch of natives as he goes along, as guides, as people to hunt and provide more food, and as just general laborers to carry stuff and work around the camps. That's causing incredible amounts of social disruption at that time. So I want you to kind of imagine what it would be like to be in one of those village sites and have this group of Europeans come in, take your food, take a bunch of people as slaves, and then move on to the next place. There's also a lot of political instability caused by this. So if we can go back to the PowerPoint, that province of Kaskee, that Parkin site in northeast Arkansas, we actually have some written accounts of De Soto's encounter there. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is that the chief at Kaskee actually is sort of solicitous towards De Soto and actually wants to try to make friends. And this is partially a tactic because he is constantly at war with the chiefdom of Pakaha, his neighbor. And so he's kind of using De Soto to play off of some already hostile situations. So when De Soto comes along, he also tries to work with these different groups and kind of throws a wrench into the political system there. So a lot of disruption is caused by this entrada. So we can go to the next slide now. So that's happening all in 1541. We also know that about 20 or so years later, that Mississippi Valley region that I just showed you is also facing a gigantic mega drought. And kind of emphasis on the mega here. So it's not just a drought, it's a really substantial drought. And this is recorded in tree ring data and a bunch of other climatic indicators, but it's directly affecting North America and this Mississippi Valley area. After DeSoto comes through, we have a mega drought. It's like a 1-2 punch. Those big chiefdom level societies dissolve, and we don't see evidence of them archaeologically. Now, the people who lived in them, although there has been a lot of loss of life, I'm sure, they didn't go away. They regrouped, but into different kinds of societies. So we don't see the hierarchical chiefdoms anymore. We see some different kinds of communities. We don't know precisely where groups went. That's one of the things that archaeologists want to know. You can go to the next slide. But we do know that after that, we find a lot of archaeological sites going up and down the Arkansas River that date to this time period about post-DeSoto, so 40 or so years after DeSoto goes through. So we're going to fast forward now to the 1920s, and we're going to go back to that Cardon Bottoms site in central Arkansas. And at this point in time, the climate and the economy are not, they're not in a great shape again. So just like the people were hard hit at the end of the 16th century, they're hard hit in the 1920s. So the Great Depression that we kind of think of as happening in the 30s, that happens even sooner in Arkansas. A lot of tenant farmers had several years of low crop prices, floods, and droughts. And so just general economic hard times. So at this point in time, farmers are trying to make money however they can. And one of the resources on their lands are artifacts. So all of these archaeological sites along the Arkansas River are full of artifacts. And these are things that collectors want to buy. And you can see on here some of the whole ceramic vessels that were excavated from the Cardon Bottoms site. And that's a local ad advertising that people want to buy these relics. So people are doing a lot of pot hunting, selling hundreds of pottery vessels. And at this point in time, we have a lot of people, a lot of anthropologists and archaeologists who have gotten word that this is happening, and they know that all of this pot hunting is going on. So they go down and actually purchase some of these pottery vessels and buy them for museums. And so we start to see the first archaeological papers being written on these finds, these incredible ceramic finds. And all of these papers mention the kind of interesting mix of ceramic types that you see at Cardon Bottoms. If we can go back to the slide, I'll show you. All of those pots are decorated kind of in a distinctive way, a little bit differently from one another. And archaeologists pay attention to kind of traditions that you see crop up geographically in one region or another. And that kind of, I'll show you here, maybe. This lovely pot in the upper right corner. Whoop. I didn't get my pen selected. Here we go. This pot right here looks like something that you would get in farther east in the Mississippi Valley. So several hundred, way down the river, far away from central Arkansas. And then these pots over here, and actually these two as well, look like something that you would find in southwest Arkansas. And so a lot of the papers that we saw written about that time talked about the fact that there was this weird amalgamation of peoples living in the central Arkansas River Valley. Now, as archaeologists, we were interested in this, but the problem with all of this information from those whole pottery vessels is that we didn't have any context to go off of. We had these beautiful ceramics, but nothing else to say about them. We didn't have information about where they were found, what kind of village they were found in, what they were next to. And so in the 2010s, a group that I was working with decided that we wanted to kind of reinvestigate this site and see if there was more information we could learn about the pottery that was there and see if we could say something about this mix of ceramic types that was there. And so we started doing a project, and it's kind of important to note here that this time around, we actually worked with some American Indian groups that might be descendants from the people who lived there. So we did this project with the Caddo, the Osage, and the Quapaw nations in partnership with them. And they were really interested in this because if you look at all of those whole ceramics that are nice and beautiful and museum quality worthy, those were all likely dug from graves. And the reason we know that is because usually in residential sites, the stuff that archaeologists find are broken. So there's the stuff that got broken and discarded in the trash. The nice stuff that survives 500 years without being smashed to smithereens has been preserved in a nice grave-like context. So these native communities were really interested in learning about the actual living spaces. So we did this project and it had three kind of components. One was we went to all of the museums that had purchased artifacts from Cardon Bottoms, and we wanted to actually see and thoroughly document what was there. So we pulled all the pottery that was supposedly from Cardon Bottoms, we measured it, we took notes, we took drawings, we made all of these observations. Then we actually went back to the site itself, and that middle picture is showing some of the geophysical work that we did ahead of excavation. Jamie in the picture is actually using a magnetometer, but we also used ground penetrating radar and electrical resistance. And all of those are methods to basically see features that are beneath the soil without disturbing them. So we were actually able to confirm that there was a village left, and we were able to target some excavation. So on the right, you're actually seeing archaeologists and our American Indian collaborators out there excavating one of 3 houses at the Cardon Bottoms site. So for the first time in a very long time, we were able to get good professional data from this site. We can go to the next slide if you want to. I should pause and ask if anybody has any questions right now. Is anything popping up in the chat? Are we okay? No?
Asked any questions yet? We can give them another couple seconds if anyone wants to put anything in.
Well, we were really happy to be able to do a thorough research project back at this site that had been hit hard by pot hunters, and we were excited to see that there were still things left to learn there, even after decades of plowing and all of that. We actually had stuff still there.
No questions yet?
You guys are a quiet group. All right. Well, I can go back to the slideshow then and show you some of the results of those excavations. So for the first time, we were able to see kind of the living situation that happened at Cardon Bottoms and not just the stuff that we found there. So this is an example on the right. Here, I'll show you. Oh, it is. So right here, you should see the electrical resistance data of a house. So this white outline on the very edge here, that's showing you the perimeter, and these 4 things in the middle correspond to these 4 things that we excavated. Those were where 4 big central support posts were. So all of the stains that you see in this picture, these are post molds, where these wooden posts would have been placed in the ground. So this is showing you kind of the floor plan of the house and where the different features were. The reconstruction on the right is done based on our archaeological findings. So these would have been wood-framed houses with these big 4 central support posts. The outside was covered with a cane matting, and we found evidence of that charred cane matting in the excavations. And not shown in that picture is that there is actually kind of a second floor loft as well. And we know that because when we were excavating, we found a layer of artifacts, then a layer of kind of detritus, and then the house floor with more artifacts on it. So that kind of shows what was still preserved. Not only did we find the one house, but we found evidence of at least 18 houses that remain in this community. And we have wonderful artifactual evidence of things that we can actually date. So we did that. And everything came back to about the very beginning of the 1600s. So this would have been post DeSoto. Some people, if they were, very young at the time of DeSoto's entrada, might have remembered him. But at this point in time, this is basically the distance that we are from World War II. So they've regrouped at this point and have dealt with all of those situations. If you can go to the next slide. Ooh, there's the question.
Rebecca, yeah, we have a quick question from Nancy asking, what size are the buildings?
Oh, that's a good question. So they're about 8 meters on a side, so that's 25-ish feet. And they're very square. And all of the houses that we found evidence of are almost the same exact size. So, same floor plan.
Thank you. And we have another question asking, what do you mean when you say that you can see them using the electric side of things?
So basically what we're doing is we walk across the ground surface. In this case, it was basically a plowed field with an electrical resistance meter that's sending little electrical pulses into the soil. And it's measuring basically what it comes into contact with. And then we can process that data. And that's what you see in that photo in the lower right there is the result of that. So it's going to be kind of different physical properties that it's measuring. And in this case, it shows you the outline of the house where those support posts were and where the big support posts were in the middle. Those are kind of lighter than the surrounding dark soil.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so next slide, I think. I know you can't read all of the words here, but this is mapping the artifacts that were on the floor of House 2. And from our excavations, we were able to find thousands of artifacts that remained. Including some European trade beads, not very many, but this helped us date the site as well, and they agree with that early 1600s date. Plenty of native ceramics were on the house floor, broken in this case, and lots of stone tools and some faunal remains, so animal bones. The very interesting thing, though, was that the native ceramics that we did find were basically broken versions of those whole vessels that I showed you earlier. So that was a really good information to know that the stuff that's in the museum really did come from this location. So if we go to the next slide, that's an example of one of the pots that was found on the house floor of House 2. And that one I helped kind of reconstruct and put together. So I'm happy with that picture. Took a little while. So if we want to go to the next slide. This is just showing you, I won't focus too long on this, but that we do find the same interesting mix of ceramics there. So we have stuff, the ones that are on the left-hand column, that look like they're made locally, that are frequently found at sites along the Arkansas River. The stuff in the middle are very distinctive and look like Caddo tradition wares that are made in Southwest Arkansas. We also have Caddo wares occurring in eastern Texas as well, but these that we found look like the stuff from Southwest Arkansas. And then we also have stuff on the right that looks like it's coming from Northeast Arkansas where those chiefdom societies were that I talked about. So those are like fun effigy vessels like that frog there. That's one of my favorites on the right. So we do see those are the Caddo people. So that's the name of the American Indian group. And I didn't put tribal names with the others because we're not sure. So we don't know exactly, we just know the geographic area that they were from. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to focus just on the Caddo tradition to kind of simplify things because those are so distinctive. So we find most of those ceramic styles only in Southwest Arkansas, but we also find examples of them at Cardon Bottoms. So we wanted to investigate this more. So in order, is there another question?
Yeah, we just did get one more question, which is, does this show evidence that there was trading between different groups of people in this area?
That's exactly the question we're trying to answer. And that's what a lot of archaeologists had assumed at this time, is that we only find these things here, they're very distinctive, but yet we find a bunch of them up at Cardon Bottoms. So it must be evidence of trade. So that's kind of the answer that the question we were trying to answer. And I'll try to go through how we went about that. So the thing I wanted to talk about first, though, is how we kind of study those ceramics and why I'm so certain that those are Caddo-style ceramics. So when you make pottery, I just wanted to kind of show people the process that the people in this community used. So all of the pottery that we're talking about was all hand-built. So people had to actually find clay sources and dig them up, process the clay a little bit so they would get rid of some inclusion, stuff that you didn't want in there, depending on what kind of pottery you were going to make. Like if you were going to make one of those fineware vessels that I showed you, those are basically like the good dishes, you know, that you bring out for special events. You might take a little more care in doing that. They also had to select a temper. And what I mean by that is stuff that you add to the clay to prevent it from cracking and doing bad things once you fire the pottery. And if you look on those two, kind of on the right-hand side, I'll show you. These two images are showing you crushed mussel shell that was used to be added as temper. This bottom one, the mussel shell has dissolved over time because of chemicals, but you can still see like the lens that's left overall. So potters had to select that tempering agent and how much to use. They then had to decide how they were going to decorate the pots, and that process kind of determined the next step, how long they had to allow the pottery to dry and all of that. And then this was all fired over an open fire. And that lower left-hand picture is from a modern day Caddo potter who makes some of his pottery in a more traditional manner. And he learned this from Geraldine Redcorn. So next slide. So here's that question. So is this actually evidence of trade? If we were just to look at the pottery, I would tell you, yeah, that's what it looks like. The pots are visually identical. So the Caddo style pots from Cardon Bottoms are exactly like what you would see in Caddo communities in Southwest Arkansas. So away from the Arkansas River. So in order to answer this, I wanted to have an independent line of evidence though. So they visually look the same, but I wanted to know, are they chemically the same? And there are some ways that we can do this. So you can go to the next slide. So what I did is I went and collected and got permission from the Arkansas Archaeological Survey to sample some pottery sherds found at those southwestern Arkansas Caddo sites. So all of those dots on the map are places where I selected sherds that looked like what we were finding in Cardon Bottoms to the north. And I said, these are things I want to chemically test and see if they match what we're finding at Cardon Bottoms. So I did that. We can go to the next slide. I did that using a method called Neutron Activation analysis. And this was my foray into trying to be like a nuclear scientist for a day. It's not exactly like that, but it does sound cool. I actually had to work with the University of Missouri Research Reactor to do this. So what is done actually is your sample is prepared. It's actually relatively simple to do. You just want to get contaminants out of it. And you take a tiny little sherd, like the one that I chose on the right, and I actually used the Dremel tool to cut off just a little bit, so I didn't have to destroy too much. And then they kind of process it into a little pellet and expose it to a source of neutrons, which sounds super cool, but it's placed into a beam and irradiated, essentially. And what that does is it kind of makes everything unstable, and the particles are giving off gamma rays. And I won't go too much into actually the mechanics of this, but the important thing is that each chemical element will send off a different signal. It decays following a slightly different path, and we can measure this. So we can actually get kind of a chemical fingerprint of all of the chemical elements that are in the clay that was used to make pottery. Now, most of the stuff that's in pottery is going to be the same from clay to clay to clay, but there are things that we call trace elements that are just kind of small amounts that are there from the local geology that help us distinguish things from one place to another. So after that analysis, we can go to the next slide. I'll kind of show you what we found. And the results were kind of surprising because I was 100% expecting this to be evidence that the pots were coming from Southwest Arkansas. But it doesn't look like that was the case. So this messy graph is just showing you 2 of the chemical elements that we tested. But I actually did analysis using some statistical tests on 30 different elements at once to make these groupings. So this is showing you stuff that the circles are kind of showing you the groups around, it shows groups that are chemically the same, I should say. So on the right, all of those little triangles that I say have Washita River samples written on, those are all of the comparative samples that I collected in Southwest Arkansas. So all of those grouped together in a nice little group by itself with none of the stuff from Cardon Bottoms in there. So if you look on the left, that larger group, all of the samples from Cardon Bottoms are in that group. And particularly in that kind of group that says micro in the middle. It's really just one chemical group, but the black dots are slightly more similar to one another than the others. So that kind of gave us a sense of pause. So none of our stuff from Cardon Bottoms matched the stuff from Southwest Arkansas. If we go to the next slide, that means this. So all of the Caddo style pottery found at Cardon Bottoms looks like it was locally produced right there in the Arkansas River Valley. And that brings me to a new question. Like, I was so sure visually that those things were the same. And they're not just the same from the outside, where you can go ahead and hit the next thing. You know, they're not just the same from the outside. So you might say, are the residents just like copying? It's like a knockoff Caddo pot that they're producing in the Central Arkansas River Valley. I don't think that's the case, because it's not just the outside that is copied. It's all of those steps that I talked about. They're selecting the clay the same way. They're processing it the same. They're adding the same amount of temper. They're building the pot up the same way. They're doing things like turning the lip over in the same fashion, things that you would do kind of without thinking if you had learned how to make pottery from your mom, for example. Just things that you do by habit, and they're all identical. If we go to the next slide, I'll tell you why I think that, you know, the answer is probably not. I think that there's actually a subset of people that come from those communities in Southwest Arkansas that moved to Cardon Bottoms to create a new community. So this is going back to kind of what I was talking about post-DeSoto and all of that destruction and instability that expedition caused, as well as additional European incursions into the Southeast, along with all of that climatic havoc I talked about. So at this point in time, across the Southeast, groups are moving around and regrouping in new formations. So I think what we see at Cardon Bottoms is actually evidence of multiple groups coming together and living in what archaeologists call a coalescent society. So basically kind of an amalgam of different groups forming a new community together. And we can partially see this in the layout of the houses as well, because I think we actually see different neighborhoods. So this is showing you some more of that electrical resistance data, and I've outlined the houses in yellow so you can see them. And then I put red lines around kind of different spatially discrete groupings. So these are 2 different neighborhoods that you see on the slide. The one towards the left looks like houses that are kind of lined up into a couple of rows parallel to one another. And they're arranged a little bit differently than the houses with a circle around them that are kind of oriented in towards each other and around a big plaza area or kind of a gathering space in the middle. And then there's actually another neighborhood that's off the slide. I can't show you. I don't have all of that data. But it's about 60 meters to the east, where houses are arranged in another kind of random order, but clustered together. So it might be that people are kind of maintaining their former ancestral ties, but at the same time, they're together like forming a new community. And we see evidence of that in a couple of other aspects of the artifacts that we find there. So I'll show you one last example of pottery. So this one, I'll show you on the slide, is just an example of what we're calling kind of like a hybrid vessel, for lack of a better term. So if I were to look just at the shape of this bowl, so this is a bowl kind of spread out and broken. We don't have all the pieces, so I can't put it together. But the shape of that bowl is very much like the shape of other bowls that we find in Cardon Bottoms and surrounding sites. So in the Arkansas River Valley pottery making tradition, we see pots that are shaped that way. What we don't see is the design elements that are on there. So if you look here, those are incised lines. So we've got like an oval, and then they've done some cross hatching on the slide. That's a Caddo design element. So that's something that Caddo style pottery would use pretty frequently. However, whoever this potter was is kind of breaking the design rules that a Caddo potter would follow. So Caddo pottery is like very rule-based, and you wouldn't see necessarily this combination of vessel shape with that design element on it. You would see that design element somewhere else on a different shaped vessel. So this might be an example of, you know, people from different ceramic traditions kind of getting together and forming their own new spin on things. I also think it's really kind of interesting to think about where they are and the time period that we're talking about. So now that this is post-DeSoto, early 1600s that this Cardon Bottoms community is in, if we think about what's happening to the east of them, there are a bunch of different communities that are getting hit again with new groups of Europeans coming in. They're bringing epidemic diseases. They're also bringing firearms into the southeastern United States. They're disrupting the social system that was there. That's happening to the west of the Cardon Bottoms community as well, south and west. They're about as far away, this community is about as far away from those happenings as they can get, while still being in a great spot for agriculture and in a community that has enough resources to support them, at least for the time being. So while they were making this community, we kind of see it as like a refuge where these different pieces of different social groups are coming together, forming a new community identity, and making the best of things in a situation that's rapidly changing around them, at least for a generation. And that's what we have, kind of this snapshot of the village in the 1600s. So that's basically what I have to present tonight. I'm happy to take questions. I probably skipped over a lot of things, so if you have questions, I'm happy to answer. My last slide is just acknowledgements of people who helped put this research together. All right.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Dr. Rebecca, for sharing all this with us. And if anyone has questions, you can unmute yourself and I can call on you, or you're welcome to continue using the chat feature.
Either way is fine with me.
I did have a quick question for any non-archaeologists who are listening. You notice you said the word sherd a lot. Could you explain more about what that means?
That's our snooty term for a broken piece of pottery. So a lot of people say like glass shard. We say sherd for broken ceramics. So the little broken fragmented pieces.
Thank you.
In terms of how many native tribes were there. So there are 3 different ceramic traditions that we can see, but we can't always equate those exactly to tribal groups. What we can do is we can say that they're probably from this geographic area. Now, the reason I did that with the Caddo is that we have basically 1,000 years of cultural development in that one area where we really are kind of certain of the cultural continuity from one time period to another. In the rest of Arkansas, it's a little bit more difficult because of some of the reasons that I mentioned, because groups are moving in and out. The Quapaw, for instance, that's the tribal group that Arkansas is named after, actually. Their other name is Acancia, so it kind of sounds like Arkansas. They were kind of newcomers, relative newcomers to Arkansas. We don't know if they got there just before DeSoto's Entrada came through or right around the same time. There are oral traditions that document their transition to their movement from the eastern US down to Arkansas. And we also have archeological evidence of kind of them coming in, but the timing is not exact. So we don't like to say specific tribes, but we did work with the Caddo, the Osage, and the Quapaw because they're likely related in some way to the people who were there in the early 1600s.
Thank you. And do we see other archaeological places that are like this in other parts of the country?
Absolutely. So Cardon Bottoms, that site, is one of many along the Arkansas River that has evidence of multiple ceramic traditions, slightly different mixes though. So we probably see several of these communities there. And this pattern that I've been talking about is also something that people kind of see in the plains in some instances. It's also something that you see happening throughout the Southeast at different points in time. And we know that kind of the coalescent communities of different groups kind of joining together is how some of the major groups in the Southeast, those major tribes that we know of today, actually came to be. So like the Chickasaw, for example, they're an example of a coalescent community that became a tribal nation.
And we have another question about after you complete this type of research, what types of things do you do with this? What next steps get taken?
Well, we try to tell people about it. So we actually just published a chapter in a book on this topic, and the larger book is about these kinds of things happening throughout the Southeast. If I could tell you off the bat, I don't remember what the final title was, but it just came out this month, actually. So we publish things, and we're also kind of looking for the next opportunity to kind of expand on the research. So there are, like I said, other communities that kind of display those mixes of ceramics based on the museum collections. The problem is we haven't done professional archaeological work at most of those places. And that's for a number of reasons. That's because of funding. All of this takes money in some form or another. It's also because of land ownership issues. So the land that we were working on was private land, and we had to get permission from landowners to do that, and they were happy to work with us for the time being. They actually ended up turning that agricultural field into a conservation area, and we helped them identify where to plant trees without affecting archaeological resources that were there. But that also will make it harder if we ever wanted to come back there, because I think they're happy with the kind of conservation refuge that's there and probably don't want us disturbing them again. So that's an issue.
We have another question here. I'm curious what your Native collaborators think about the project's results.
They're actually, so there's kind of a mix here. I think on one hand, they're very happy with the project and the way it turned out. I actually investigated part of this. I did some interviews with people to see what they thought about the results of the project, and by and large, the response was positive. I did see a little bit of disappointment though, because I think some of our tribal collaborators, particularly on the Osage and the Quapaw, wanted a more definitive answer as like, are these our ancestors or are they not? And where we were able to say Caddo, a lot of times we weren't able to have that same certainty for the other groups, and so that can be a little disconcerting, but we were able to demonstrate some artistic continuities that you can see and kind of link to larger belief systems that those other tribal groups share. And so I think that was very exciting to them and fulfilling, and they were overall very happy to be included in the project from the start to the finish. So we weren't just like asking for permission. They got input as to like what we did, what questions we asked, where we presented the results. that kind of thing.
Thank you. And then it sounds like there were a lot of components in this. How long have you been working on your research?
So the project itself started in 2010, and I worked on it through 2014, and there are still people analyzing results today, so like a decade later. So I mentioned like there's close to 90,000 artifacts. That takes a long time to go through, and I focused a lot on the pottery because that's what we focused on first. There's a lot of animal bones there that will tell us about diet that we haven't fully analyzed, but I can give you like a sneak peek. And the same thing with the stone tools. There's a lot to go through there, and it hasn't been given the same attention as the pottery, but we could.
Okay.
Because most of us had pottery emphases, so that was kind of our specialization, and also because of that link to the museum collection, so it was kind of the easiest starting point.
And yes, so thank you again to Rebecca Wiewel for sharing this great research with us, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.